Hello, people of Earth. This week's highlights include action on solar panel waste and packaging waste, huge contracts in Queensland and Western Australia to support new clean energy projects, and New South Wales farmers are opting in to protect nature. I'm Franziska Curran, and this is Earthed, a short weekly podcast on what's happening in climate, nature and sustainability around Australia and what it means for your work and your community.
And I'm Murray Griffin. And remember, if you want to dig deeper and find the links to everything we mention in this episode, head to earthed.au, that's earthed.au, and sign up for our free newsletter. Plus, if you head to that site, you can also find out about ways to support our work. And before we get going, here's this week's quiz. How much money do you think the ACT's subsidy scheme for household energy upgrades has saved people since it started in 2021? Is it 50 million? Is it 100 million? Or is it 200 million? Stay tuned to find out.
First up, Australia's Environment Minister Murray Watt and the Environment Ministers from all states and territories met in Canberra last week, and they talked about everything from packaging waste to environmental assessment procedures. The ministers agreed to reform national packaging regulation, and they agreed to reform Australia's waste and recycling legislation, with a focus on packaging and used batteries. They'll consider more detailed arrangements at their next meeting. Ministers also discussed their plans to work more closely together as a result of last year's overhaul of Australia's main environmental law, known as the EPBC Act. One example of this cooperation is joint work by the federal and Queensland governments on bioregional guidance plans. Ministers also approved an implementation plan for Australia's strategy for nature, although the plan doesn't seem to be publicly available yet. And they talked about the Australian Bushland Program, which is expected to protect and conserve an extra 2.3 million hectares of land, and eventually a lot more.
A lot of people are getting very concerned about what's going to happen to solar panels at the end of their life. And to try and come up with a solution, the federal government is inviting tenders to run a pilot program to recycle them. The pilot project will establish about 100 collection sites across Australia and aims to recycle up to 250,000 panels. Meanwhile, the New South Wales EPA has told a Senate inquiry into recycling solar PV waste that Australia needs a solar panel recycling scheme up and running within the next 12 months. The New South Wales EPA is taking the lead in developing a stewardship scheme that could operate nationally.
At the state government level, there's news on waste reduction efforts from New South Wales and Queensland. The New South Wales government has introduced to Parliament a plastic reduction and container recycling bill. The bill empowers the EPA to specify that single-use plastic items be designed to be recycled and that they have labels showing how they should be recycled. The bill also contains measures to encourage more people to use reusable coffee cups instead of single-use cups. And Queensland's Environment Minister Andrew Powell has introduced a bill to strengthen the state's container deposit scheme by strengthening arrangements for how the scheme operates.
There's been a fair few developments in Australia this week that focus on international developments and what they mean for climate and sustainability action here. First up, Australia and the European Union have agreed on a free trade agreement after many years of negotiating, and the Australian government says it will be the first free trade agreement to contain a binding commitment to implement Paris Agreement obligations. The free trade agreement will also eliminate tariffs on environmental goods like wind turbines, lithium batteries, and solar panel components, as well as removing tariffs on Australian critical minerals and hydrogen. The free trade agreement doesn't make any mention of two European environmental initiatives: its regulation to stop deforestation and its scheme to levy carbon emissions at EU borders, which is known as the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism.
In other news with an international focus, the Senate has passed the High Seas Biodiversity Bill, which implements Australia's obligations under the UN High Seas Treaty that came into force at the start of this year. The bill passed after the government agreed to Greens amendments that strengthen penalties for breaches and to include references to marine protected areas. The bill, which is supported by the coalition, is now before the House of Representatives.
And we love that treaty, don't we, Franziska?
We do. We've got a podcast episode that you can listen to of Tracked Changes where we interviewed Rebecca Hubbard from the High Seas Alliance.
There's a lot of good things that could come out of this year's international climate change talks, which are being led by Australia, Turkey, and Pacific Island nations. The Climate Change Authority has just released advice that recommends one useful result could be a decarbonisation deals platform. These decarbonisation deals would involve willing governments and industries, and the Climate Authority suggests that Australia could announce a deals platform focusing on green iron, low emissions fuels, and industrial electrification.
Finally, on the international front, the Australian Parliament's Joint Committee on Treaties has unanimously recommended that the Australian government ratify an agreement to establish the Pacific Resilience Facility, or PRF. The facility will fund activities that help make Pacific countries more resilient to climate change. Australia has set aside $100 million for the PRF. Other pledges have come from countries including Saudi Arabia, which has committed to US $50 million.
Staying in Canberra, and after holding 11 public hearings and receiving hundreds of submissions, a Senate committee inquiry into climate and energy misinformation has issued its final report. The report recommends giving more money to carry out community engagement activities to the Australian Energy Infrastructure Commissioner, whose job it is to make sure that the shift to clean energy is smooth and fair. The report also recommends that Australia officially endorse the Declaration on Information Integrity on Climate Change that was launched at the COP30 climate talks held last year in Brazil. That declaration has already been signed by economies including the EU, Canada and Brazil. In additional comments included in the Senate report, Senator David Pocock and Senator Andrew McLaughlin said the recommendations didn't go far enough. They urged the government to require social media companies to detect and remove bot accounts that impersonate humans. And the Greens recommended that digital platforms be fined for amplifying false and misleading information on climate change and energy.
Australia's Productivity Commission has launched an inquiry that is looking at government's progress under the National Water Initiative, as required by the Federal Water Act. As part of the inquiry, the Commission will examine the progress of water utilities in reducing and reusing waste and in moving towards net zero emissions. The inquiry comes as the federal government is working with states and territories to develop a new national water agreement. And in other news, the Western Australian government has released a new report on rising pressures on the state's water resources as a result of increasing demand and climate change.
A new study by a government agency has examined how climate change and extreme weather is going to affect the cost of home insurance. The Australian Prudential Regulation Authority regulates insurers and super funds, and it's just released a study that explores how a changing climate could affect home insurance affordability. APRA estimates that 1 in 7 Australian houses is uninsured today, but it warns that could rise to around 1 in 4 homes being uninsured by 2050, which is equivalent to an additional 1 million homes lacking adequate home insurance. APRA also warns that annual losses from weather-related events could rise from around $7 billion a year today to more than $16 billion by 2050.
There's some good news this week on gas supply and demand. The Australian Energy Market Operator has released its latest gas adequacy outlook, which shows the likelihood of gas supply shortfalls isn't quite as serious as originally predicted. In an analysis of the AEMO gas outlook, the Grattan Institute's Hamish McKenzie noted that gas demand is now forecast to drop much faster than anyone thought over the next 20 years. According to McKenzie, household gas demand was already set to plummet from 170 petajoules down to 51 petajoules. Now it's forecast to hit 35, an 80% drop. McKenzie said that if household demand drops that much, it will almost certainly mean the end of reticulated pipeline network, which means it will probably drop closer to 100%. He added, industrial demand was forecast last year to be stable over the next 20 years, and this year they are forecasting it will drop 26%.
It's a pretty amazing shift, isn't it?
Very big change, yeah.
In a major development, the federal and Queensland governments have announced they will each invest $1 billion to ensure continued operations at Rio Tinto's Boyne aluminium smelter in Gladstone. Under the terms of the deal, the Boyne smelter will increasingly be powered by renewable electricity. The federal contribution will come via the Future Made in Australia initiative. The government will provide the funds to Rio Tinto over 10 years in the form of credits linked to the amount of green aluminium it produces. Rio Tinto is doing its bit as well. The government funding commitments build on power purchase agreements signed by Rio Tinto in recent years to underwrite almost $7.5 billion worth of new investment in renewable energy and transmission assets in central Queensland. Since 2024, Rio Tinto has contracted more than 2.8 gigawatts of new renewable energy from projects in Queensland.
Over on the other side of Australia, there was another big renewable energy development this week. Western Australian government-owned Synergy and the Water Corporation have signed power purchase agreements that will enable the construction of more than 1 gigawatt of renewable generation capacity. The agreements will support the state's ambition to close all publicly owned coal-fired power stations by 2030. Synergy has agreed to buy renewable electricity from Zephyr Energy's 470-megawatt Parramamarang wind farm and the 130-megawatt Condonin wind farm, which is being developed by a Shell Energy and Foresight joint venture. And the WA Water Corporation has signed an offtake deal with Alinta's 550-megawatt Murray wind farm. The 3 wind projects will have sufficient capacity to power 800,000 homes. Think tank Beyond Zero Emissions has welcomed the new power purchase agreements with the 3 wind farms as landmark deals. However, it cautioned that WA's development of new grid infrastructure isn't keeping pace with all the generation projects that have received development approval in the state.
In Queensland, almost all of the state has been activated for disaster recovery in the first 3 months of this year as a result of extreme weather. But that hasn't stopped the state government from pushing to rapidly open up new fossil gas and oil fields. Queensland's Disaster Recovery Minister Anne Ley last week told state parliament that about 90% of Queensland's landmass has been activated for disaster recovery in the first 3 months of this year. And Primary Industries Minister Tony Perrott made clear the terrible toll it was taking on farmers and regional communities. Perrott told Parliament that across the regions you can see the devastation on producers' faces. You can hear the despair in their voices. The minister also warned that recovery will not be overnight. It will take years. In the same week, Premier David Crisafulli told Parliament that his government is working hard to open up Australia's first major new oil province since the 1970s. Commenting on the potential for new gas and oil projects in Queensland, Resources Minister Dale last told State Parliament that, "Since I started in this role, my mantra has been very clear. I'll sign, you drill." Minister last accused Labor of, and I'm quoting here, trying to bury their heads in the sand, pander to their greenie mates, and let ecological ideology run rampant in an attempt to shut down our most important industries. It's a bruising place, a parliament.
Despite its love of gas and oil, the Queensland government is also backing biofuels, which are a zero-emissions substitute for fossil gas and oil. The state government has welcomed a new green biotechnology solutions joint venture that has been established between Japan's Nippon Steel Trading and Queensland's Energreen. The joint venture will create a large-scale Pongamia tree plantation near Emerald, where the Pongamia seeds will be used to make biofuels. And we can expect to see more news from Queensland on biofuels because a state parliamentary committee inquiry into bioenergy is due to report today.
While we're talking about parliamentary inquiries, transcript is now available from a recent hearing convened by a Victorian parliamentary committee that's inquiring into what to do with unwanted offshore oil and gas infrastructure once oil and gas fields are no longer operational. The committee heard evidence from representatives of Exxon, Woodside and government departments, as well as union representatives.
The New South Wales EPA has released draft approval methods for modelling and assessing air pollutants, which aim to strengthen efforts to reduce fine particle pollution, which is known as PM 2.5. Proposed changes include a new expectation that emissions of PM 2.5 will be minimised to the maximum extent possible. And the draft document also includes more guidance on how the EPA will regulate fugitive dust. The approved methods are important because they will be used by the EPA to decide licence limits for premises that it regulates.
The New South Wales EPA has also announced that its targeted compliance program projects for this financial year will include reviewing national pollutant inventory data in the Sydney Basin to assess compliance with regulatory limits. The project will focus on NOx and SOx pollution, with the EPA pointing out that NOx and SOx emissions have a major impact on Sydney's air quality. The New South Wales EPA will this year also focus on examining how companies are disposing of mixed construction and demolition waste.
Wow, the New South Wales EPA has been so busy. Golly.
They do a
gosh,
lot.
so busy.
They get a lot done.
On the biodiversity front, there is some good news.
Did you know that at one time there was actually talk, in the last few years about setting up a Queensland EPA, which would have been amazing. But
I didn't know that.
It sort of snuck into a discussion paper on environmental regulatory reform, but it sort of vanished without trace very quickly.
On the biodiversity front, there is some good news from New South Wales. The state government says it has had strong landholder response to its latest Biodiversity Conservation Trust fixed price offer, with owners of 50 properties keen to proceed. Landholders will receive annual fixed price payments for agreeing to permanently protect specified areas of vegetation, and the protection requirements would be registered on their property titles. Another round of expressions of interest for Biodiversity Conservation Trust fixed price offers will open later this year. As a result of the current expressions of interest, Biodiversity Conservation Trust staff will now assess more than 39,000 hectares of land, working with landholders to develop conservation management plans. Wow, that is cool.
Yeah, it is. One thing that people in government agencies mightn't think about when they buy electric vehicles is the possibility that they might have been made using labour that we would consider to be a modern form of slavery. The New South Wales Office of the Anti-Slavery Commissioner has just issued 2 reports that examine modern slavery risks in electric car and bus supply chains, and it warns that Transport for New South Wales must do more to remove modern slavery risks from the supply chain for its purchases of electric buses. The Commissioner notes that Transport for New South Wales will be purchasing 7,500 low-emission buses, but it says there are significant deficiencies in its current arrangements for managing modern slavery risks. The report notes that New South Wales public agencies are required by law to take reasonable steps to ensure the goods and services that they buy are not products of modern slavery. In a separate report, also released last week, the Commissioner presents a high-level analysis of modern slavery risks in the supply chains for electric vehicles and related infrastructure. Meanwhile, you don't have to go overseas for modern slavery risks to be a concern. A New South Wales parliamentary committee is currently examining modern slavery risks in regional parts of the state, mostly focused on the treatment of foreign workers on farms. Transcript is now available of the most recent hearing held by that inquiry.
And here's the answer to our quiz question. The ACT's Sustainable Household Scheme has now saved the people of Canberra more than $100 million on household bills since it started in 2021. The ACT government said the scheme has provided discount loans totaling $276 million to households since it started. The upgrades funded through the loans, which range in size from $2,000 to $15,000, are estimated to have already saved participating households a total of $100 million, with those savings continuing. Not surprisingly, the scheme has been popular, with 1 in every 8 homes across Canberra taking out a loan under the scheme. 1 in every 8. That is popular.
It is very popular. Sticking with state energy efficiency and clean energy subsidy schemes, and there have been 2 important developments in Victoria. The Victorian government has gazetted regulations that make the installation of ceiling insulation an activity that can be subsidised through its Victorian Energy Upgrade Scheme. And that's a really big step because ceiling insulation can dramatically cut household heating and cooling bills. And the Victorian government is also planning changes to methods under the Victorian Energy Upgrades program to provide stronger incentives for industrial and commercial businesses to reduce their use of fossil gas for industrial heat.
The Net Zero Economy Authority was established by the Australian government to make sure workers in coal and gas-dependent areas can move to good jobs and get good support as coal and fossil gas industries close. This week, the authority applied to the Fair Work Commission to establish an energy industry jobs plan that would support workers who will be affected by the closure of Origin Energy's coal-fired Eraring power station. Eraring is Australia's largest power station. The authority's application names Origin Energy, Centennial Coal, and 11 other businesses as employers that should be included in the plan, and between them, these businesses employ more than 1,300 workers. If the Fair Work Commission decides to implement the plan, workers at the 11 businesses will receive transition support from their employers.
In Tasmania, an independent review of the state's Climate Change Act has recommended that the state government establish an independent body to advise on emissions reduction efforts and to monitor progress. The review also recommends establishing a separate mandatory adaptation planning process under the Act, and it says considering climate change should be mandatory as part of all major government decisions. The report warns that stakeholder confidence in the Tasmanian government's ability to deliver meaningful climate results remains low.
The CSIRO was also in the news this week. Firstly, it has successfully trialled AI-powered robots adapted from the mining industry to inspect, monitor and maintain PV panels on large solar farms. The robots automatically detect faults across PV panels, for example, dust buildup, physical damage, and wiring that needs repair. Secondly, CSIRO is inviting small and medium businesses in Queensland to apply for its Innovate to Grow course, which focuses on the circular economy and sustainability. The free 8-week research and development training program is funded by the Queensland Government.
There have been two developments on the grants front in Western Australia. The state government has announced it will provide $2 million to Camco Engineering to establish Western Australia's first manufacturing facility capable of making wind tower anchor cages. The investment was made through the state government's $8 million Wind Energy Manufacturing Co-Investment Program. And businesses and organisations in Collie can now apply for grants of up to $100,000 for projects that deliver significant benefits to the local community, including projects that help workers move away from coal-related industries.
There's a new method for earning carbon credits on farms that is under development, but a lot of people aren't happy with the draft version of it. The Australian Industry Greenhouse Network, which represents major emitters, is one of them. Its submission on the draft says the scope of the method should be broader and include activities such as soil carbon, avoided clearing, and livestock emissions management. The Australian Industry Greenhouse Network also warns that integrity settings must be proportionate to risk, and they should not be so punitive as to discourage genuine abatement opportunities.
In other very brief news, firstly, the federal government has listed 5 expectations for developers of data centres and AI infrastructure, including a requirement that they support Australia's energy transition. Secondly, the federal government is developing guidance on estimating and reporting greenhouse gas emissions in agriculture and forestry to help farmers and land managers meet increasing demands for the supply of this kind of emissions data. And thirdly, a New South Wales parliamentary inquiry into the impact of renewable energy zones will hold a public hearing in Sydney today. Those giving evidence include representatives of Farmers for Climate Action, the Next Economy and the Clean Energy Council, as well as representatives of several New South Wales government departments.
That's it for now. You're all up to date. The next Earthed pod will land in your feed next Tuesday. Please rate and review the show to help spread the word about it, and check out our newsletter and our associate Track Changes podcast.
And remember, if you want to dig deeper and find the links to everything we mentioned in this episode, head to earthed.au, earthed.au, and sign up for our free newsletter. Plus, if you head to that site, you can also find out about ways to support our work. See you next time.
See you next week.